Hello and welcome to an analysis of Ozymandias by Percy Shelley. This video is part of our Power and Conflict series and we'll be looking at the various themes and contexts of the poem, as well as where to find the best quotes for your essays. As we work through the poem, I'm going to be dividing everything into four main themes: power, decay, art and religion. Each quote that we discuss will belong to one of these categories, and I'm going to use the following colours so we can easily distinguish them. Before we start, I'm going to give you a quick summary of the poem. If you haven't read it before, I would encourage you to pause this video and take a look before we continue. Essentially, this poem is all about an ancient statue, and it's told through the eyes of a traveller who has seen it firsthand. The statue in question is that of Ramesses II, who Shelley refers to as Ozymandias. Ramesses was an ancient Egyptian ruler, and so we might expect this poem to be some kind of a grand spectacle, but it's not. Instead, the statue lies in ruins. The traveller briefly admires the sculptor who created it, he recites the inscription, and then he finishes by noting how barren the desert is around him. Alright, let's have a look at the main themes. When we're thinking about this collection as a whole, Ozymandias stands out as a poem that is deeply concerned with power. Specifically, Shelley is interested in ideas of human authority and how it fades over time. I want to start by looking at the inscription, which begins on line 10, and we're going to focus on two key verbs in line 11, look and despair. These are direct commands which Ozymandias gives to anyone who reads his words, but we are challenged to see exactly what we should be looking at and why we should be despairing. Instead, we find the phrase, "nothing beside remains," on line 12. Shelley places a full stop here for emphasis, as he wants us to really focus on what he's trying to say. The fact that Ozymandias tells us to look at nothing and despair at nothing severely undermines his ability to control us, as we're unable to complete the task even if we wanted to. The traveller goes on to describe the Egyptian statue as a colossal wreck on line 13, and although this isn't an oxymoron, we can see how these words just feel kind of weird together. On the one hand, colossal has these powerful connotations, but the fact that Shelley is describing a wreckage just shows how far the mighty have fallen. Once a colossal ruler, Ozymandias is now nothing more than stone amongst sand. A related concept that I want you to think about is dilution, as it's a really useful way of visualising the next point. By definition, diluting something will make it less potent, and that is exactly what happens in the structure of this poem. Consider how many people we have to go through before we actually hear Ozymandias' voice. We start with the I of the poem, who is then displaced by the voice of the traveller, who then reads out an inscription written by the sculptor, who himself has transcribed it from Ozymandias. For a poem that is named after the Egyptian king, it seems strange that we have to go through three different people before we even get to the title character. And that's not even counting Percy Shelley, who we as readers have to go through as well. Just like adding water to apple juice, these layers dilute the power of Ozymandias' voice and force him into a minor role in his own poem. For me, the most important word in this poem is decay, which Shelley uses on line 12. It's a fantastic word because it encapsulates how human power has faded over time, how it's grown old and become impotent. Ozymandias' power has truly decayed over thousands of years, and all that we are left with is rubble. Ultimately, his statue is a metaphor for human power and how fickle it truly is. We cannot extend our power beyond the grave, and this is something which Ozymandias shows emphatically. I'd like to start by thinking about the form of this poem, and how we can apply ideas of decay to more than just language. Because Ozymandias has 14 lines, we can say that it's a sonnet, which is a type of poem that was popular with writers such as Shakespeare. In particular, I want you to think about what we call a Petrarchan sonnet. I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but I would recommend that you look into it in your own time if you're interested. So a Petrarchan sonnet has two sections. The first section is called the octave, and it's the first 8 lines of the poem. The second section is called the sestet, and it's the last 6 lines of the poem. These two sections are separated by what we call a volta, and it's essentially just a turning point of the poem. When we read a Petrarchan sonnet, it's usually very obvious where this turning point is, because the speaker will use words such as but or instead in the 9th line. However, if we look at the 9th line of Ozymandias, we simply get the word and. This isn't a turning point at all, it's a continuation, and this should disjoint us as readers. The thing to remember is that Shelley actively denies the volta, and decays the sonnet form as a result. By corrupting the sonnet in this way, Shelley is taking his ideas to the next level, infecting every part of this poem with a sense of inescapable decay. We can see this in the rhyme structure too, with a repeated use of half rhymes. Look at lines 2 and 4 and the link between stone and frown. It nearly rhymes, but the different O sounds don't quite match. The same thing happens again on lines 9 and 11 with appear and despair, as Shelley intentionally places these words together to manifest the reality of decay. Just as the statue crumbles at our feet, so too does the rhyme scheme, as it becomes increasingly compromised by these disjointed half rhymes. So, for Shelley, human authority and power decays over time. However, he's not completely dismissive of humanity, and there's some really interesting things that we can say about the power of art. Notice how vivid the traveller's description is of this statue, as he notes the wrinkled lip on line 5. This is a piece of stone that is thousands of years old, yet passers-by can still make out the fine detail. The fact that the lip is wrinkled emphasises the sheer precision and skill of the sculptor who crafted it. Now, Shelley wants us to make a key distinction here. Notice how the sculptor isn't actually named in the poem. This shows us that it is not actually him who is important here, it is the art that he has created. Whereas human power will inevitably fade away, the power of the artist is to create something that is immortal. Consider lines 6 and 7, with the phrase, "It sculptor well those passions red which yet survive." Here, art is intrinsically linked with ideas of survival, and Shelley is intentionally juxtaposing this against Ramesses, who of course didn't survive. On a contextual level, Shelley sees himself as the sculptor, seeking to create a sense of immortality with his poetry. The evidence for this is clear in the fact that we are still reading one of his poems today, admiring the skill of the artist even after death. Therefore, we can make the argument that this poem has some allegorical elements to it, as the sculptor represents the real-life Shelley. Taking this idea of allegory further, we should also note how Shelley wanted to make a political comment, and he uses the character of Ozymandias to represent his own king, George III. It's important to note that Shelley was a pacifist and wanted to critique the war-hungry King of England. By comparing him to Ozymandias, Shelley reinforces the fragility of the king's earthly power and points out that he too will fade away. Perhaps the best example of this comes on line 8, with the phrase, "the hand that mocked." Here, Shelley is referring to the sculptor, and mocked is used as a verb which shows artistic creation. The dictionary defines the verb mock as making a replica or an imitation of something, and we can certainly see how this is the case. He's making a sculpture of Ramesses II. However, we can also read a double meaning here, and note how the verb mock might also mean to tease or laugh at someone. In this reading, the sculptor is scornful towards the Egyptian king, just like Shelley is to King George. Therefore, we can see this relationship between Shelley and the sculptor in this poem, not only because they create immortal art, but also because they use it to forward their own political meanings. The final theme that I want to touch on is religion. It isn't the main theme of the poem, but it is certainly one worth considering, especially because it acts as a point of comparison to other texts. Perhaps we can start by thinking about why Shelley chose Ramesses for his poem. There are dozens of Egyptian kings to choose from, but many argue that Shelley chose Ramesses because of his biblical connotations. Historians believe that Ramesses was on the throne at the time of Moses, and you might even remember him as a character in the film Prince of Egypt. Shelley wants us to see the biblical connotations, and the fact that he chooses Ramesses sets the tone. Our main reference to religion is going to be on line 10, when Ozymandias calls himself King of Kings, a term that is usually prescribed to Jesus. It seems strange that Shelley would liken Jesus to this impotent king, but when we consider the religious context, things start to become clear. Shelley wasn't just a pacifist, but an atheist too, and he was actually expelled from Oxford University for his views on religion. For him, Christianity has become just as powerless as the crumbled statue, and perhaps Jesus himself will be next in the sand. These are radical ideas for the time, and Shelley uses Ozymandias as a vehicle for his religious beliefs. So, those are the main themes for Ozymandias, and some of the key quotes and contexts that you can use in your essays. If you want to gain full access to all the videos in this series, then make sure to check out the Power and Conflict course at 88tuition.co.uk. Thanks for watching, see you next time.